Sometimes I wish I had the job of our next guest. Professor Liz Clarke teaches in Brock's Department of Communication, Popular Culture, and Film. She just released a new book called The American Girl at War. Liz, this book takes us back to the silent film era when we see women being depicted as very important, actually, to the war effort.
Yes. So the war genre in the 1910s, which was a surprise to me when I did the research, has a huge number of female protagonists. And I think what I expected was maybe the home front heroines that you see in World War II films. But with these films, they're putting on their brothers' uniforms and going to war. And that tended to be a strong storyline that predominates the 1910s.
You use the term cross-dressing spies in some of the chapters, right? And that's actually what they are. They're pretending that they're men helping in this war effort.
Yeah, and actually that was the other thing that I found really fascinating doing this research, because this was, so the 1910s were, what, I think 50 years after the actual Civil War. So there was, historically, this isn't just a storyline that Hollywood came up with. Historically, there were actually women who would put on men's clothing and just leave their home and go to war. And then those women sometimes would just continue to live as men. So, I mean, this could be something like, it could be the early history of trans identity. But these people would continue to live as men. And then in the 1910s, when they were starting to die, people were doing autopsies and discovering that these people they thought were men had actually been women. So there were stories coming out in newspapers, and this idea of somebody disguising themselves as a man during the war and then living for the rest of their life like that would have been in the popular knowledge at the time.
That's fascinating. The prevalence of so many women in these silent films, why did you think that stopped after World War I?
Well, I mean, I think there's an argument to be made that in the 1920s, we start to see the solidification of the genres as we know them now. And the war genre, we can imagine, became masculinized in the 1920s, partly because of a sort of a pendulum swing and an attempt to, I guess, cure the kind of like post-traumatic stress that was happening from the returning soldiers or the loss of so many men in World War I, that the 1920s was a reparative decade for American masculinity, which then would translate into masculinizing the genre. So that would be my argument of why these women disappear. There's a parallel also that earlier in the 1910s, women were assumed to be the dominant audience of films. So films were made for women. And so the dominance of female protagonists was because of the audience members and because there were so many women working in like production and writing and directing. The 1920s just sees a masculinization of the industry and culture.
Some of the films are still available to be seen, even on YouTube, Joan the Woman, Pearl of the Army. But for your research, you actually had to read scripts to follow this because these movies have been lost forever.
Yes. So there's scripts, and there's this wonderful website that I use all the time called Media History Digital Library. And it has fan magazines from the 1910s, and it has trade journals, which were theaters would subscribe to them, or theater owners, and they had plot synopses and reviews of other theater owners who had screened the films with some success. So the thing that plagues all cinema or silent cinema historians is I think it's something like 90% of the movies do not exist anymore. So you have to do things like reading scripts, reading these trade magazines or the fan magazines, and sort of putting together your narrative from the stuff that surrounds the film instead of the film itself.